"Sir, keep it down. People are trying to sleep." The words cracked through the dim cabin like a slap. Passengers stirred, heads turning toward the source of the disturbance. An old man sat frozen in the middle row, his shoulders hunched, his chest rising unevenly. His name was Bruce Morris. In his hands, a small black and white photograph shook as he tried to steady it. A single tear slid down the creases of his cheek, catching the pale glow of the overhead light. I'm sorry," he whispered, voice thin, almost childlike. The flight attendant stood over him, posture stiff, arms crossed. A few passengers smirked, others shook their heads in annoyance. Bruce lowered his gaze, folding the photo close to his chest with trembling fingers. He sat smaller, trying to vanish into the seat. No one spoke, no one helped. The silence of strangers pressed heavier than the scolding. But a man a few rows back had not looked away. His eyes, sharp and calculating, stayed fixed on Bruce. His hand brushed against the pocket where his badge rested. He hadn't meant to reveal who he was, but this time he couldn't stay seated. If you believe every veteran deserves respect, please subscribe, because every view helps this message reach those who need it most. Bruce Morris sat rigid in his seat, the reprimand still echoing in his ears long after the attendant's footsteps faded down the aisle. The engines droned steadily, but for him, every sound seemed sharpened. The cough of the man across from him, the squeak of a child shifting in her mother's arms, the rattle of ice settling in a plastic cup 2 rows back. He gripped the folded photograph tighter, the edges pressing against his calloused skin, as though reminding him of what he still held on to. The air in the cabin felt dry, recycled, tinged with the faint smell of coffee long since brewed and the metallic tang of aluminum. Bruce adjusted in the narrow seat, the armrest biting against his elbow, but his movements were slow and deliberate. He placed the photograph on his lap, smoothing its creases carefully, then rested his hand over it. His other hand fumbled briefly with the stiff buckle of the seatbelt, as if confirming it was still secure, as though the routine of small order could steady his unsettled mind. Around him, passengers had already begun to sink back into their private worlds. Some leaned toward glowing screens, their faces lit faintly blue. Others tugged jackets around themselves, eyes closed in pursuit of uneasy rest. A pair of businessmen whispered over a shared document, their words clipped and precise. For Bruce, the world moved on without him, indifferent to the weight pressing against his chest. He turned slightly toward the window, but the darkness outside revealed only a faint reflection of himself. His weathered face looked back, lined, sunken, the skin loose around his jaw. His lips pressed into a thin line, and he blinked hard to clear the wetness gathering again at the corners of his eyes. The hum of the engines almost sounded like the low thrum of distant artillery, the rhythm stirring memories he wished would let him rest. The photograph lay there, fragile, a relic of a different time. In the dim cabin light, the faint outlines could still be made out. A cluster of young men in uniform, arms slung over shoulders, dust rising at their boots. Their smiles were tight but real, the kind that came only after surviving something unspoken together. Bruce traced the edge of the paper with one finger, his chest tightening with a pain far older than the present humiliation. The faint limp he had carried onto the plane earlier had not gone unnoticed.
Some passengers had watched him shuffle carefully down the narrow aisle, steadying himself against the overhead bins, each step deliberate as though negotiating uneven ground. He had refused assistance then, brushing off a steward's polite offer with a small shake of his head. That stubbornness, born of long habit, still clung to him now. To accept help felt like surrender. A sharp metallic ding announced that seatbelts should remain fastened.
Bruce adjusted slightly, the motion causing a wince that flickered across his face. His knees ached against the hard angle of the seat, and the lower back stiffened in protest. Still, he bore it without complaint. For years, silence had been his companion. Discomfort was something to be endured, not shared. His hands, though stiff, worked with careful precision. He unfolded a napkin given earlier, smoothing it across his lap as though performing a ritual meal. Even here, in the cramped space of a crowded flight, he carried himself with a certain order, a remnant of training that had never left him. It was in the way he folded, the way he aligned, the way he breathed through pain without a word. The attendant passed again, offering smiles to others but not lingering near him. Her perfume drifted in the recycled air, cloying and sharp, a reminder of the earlier sting. Bruce kept his gaze low, unwilling to meet her eyes, unwilling to invite further confrontation. His throat felt tight, not from tears now, but from the restraint of swallowing them back. He had endured worse, far worse, and yet this simple moment of disrespect cut deeper than it should. Somewhere behind him, a muffled laugh broke the monotony, followed by a hushed comment. He could not make out the words, but the tone carried. The old soldier sat straighter, his hand still over the photograph, as though shielding it from ridicule. His jaw tightened, but his lips remained sealed. Quiet dignity was his armor now, even when the edges rusted with age. The steady vibration of the aircraft seeped into his bones, mingling with the restless beat of his heart. His breath came uneven, shallow, not from fear, but from the constant effort of holding himself together. Every sigh, every shuffle from nearby passengers reminded him that he was being watched, weighed, silently judged. He tilted his head back against the seat, closing his eyes briefly. Behind the lids, images flickered, not full memories, just fragments. The flash of a sun too bright, dust swirling in hot air, the echo of laughter cut short by sudden silence. He opened them again quickly, unwilling to let the flood rise here, unwilling to break further before strangers. The photograph shifted slightly as the plane shuddered in mild turbulence. Bruce steadied it with both hands, thumb smoothing the faded ink as though grounding himself. The ritual was simple, repeated every time he traveled. A promise, a tether, a way to keep them close. Without it, the distance would be unbearable. Passengers near him had already returned to indifference. To them, he was just another weary traveler, a minor disruption quickly forgotten. Their lives moved forward, their thoughts elsewhere. Only he remained anchored to something unseen, something they could neither imagine nor bear. But not everyone had dismissed him. The man watching from behind leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing as he studied the old soldier's trembling hand and rigid posture. He noted the way Bruce held the photo, not like a keepsake, but like a lifeline. Something about the precision of his movements spoke louder than words, and the watcher's jaw tightened further. The attendant's voice rang out again at the front of the cabin, cheerful, professional, untouched by the moment she had left in her wake. The contrast felt jarring, a split between the polished veneer and the quiet fracture she had caused. Bruce sat motionless, his silence a fragile shield. The engines roared on, the cabin dim, the air heavy with quiet disapproval and unspoken stories. Bruce Morris remained alone in his grief, anchored by memory, overlooked by those around him. But one pair of eyes had not wavered. One presence had not dismissed him, and that quiet presence was beginning to stir. The engine's hum settled into a steady rhythm, a constant backdrop that pressed against the ears like an endless tide. Bruce shifted slightly, his stiff joints protesting, and tried to adjust the thin blanket that had been left folded on his lap earlier. The fabric slipped from his hands, brushing the floor, and when he leaned down to retrieve it, his back groaned in protest. His fingers trembled as he clutched the corner, and for a moment it seemed the blanket might slip from his grip entirely before he finally drew it back onto his lap. The effort did not go unnoticed. A pair of younger passengers across the aisle exchanged glances, one smirking as the other leaned close and whispered something sharp enough to draw a chuckle. Bruce kept his eyes down, pretending not to hear. The folded photograph remained on his lap beneath the blanket, his palm pressing against it protectively. It was not weakness that bent his frame. It was the weight of memory. He tugged lightly at the seatbelt resting stiff across his waist. The clasp stuck for a moment, the metal worn and stubborn, and when it finally clicked into place, the sound was louder than expected. A woman 2 rows up turned her head briefly, frowning, then returned to her glowing tablet screen. The simple act of securing himself in the seat had drawn more attention than he had wished. The narrow tray table before him rattled slightly as he lowered it with careful hands. He unfolded another napkin, smoothing it along the plastic surface as though setting a table. His movements were deliberate, slow, not from indecision, but from habit. He had always believed in order. Even now, even here. The world might pass him by, but his rituals grounded him. A steward walked the aisle offering drinks, and Bruce asked for water in a voice so soft it almost vanished beneath the rumble of the engines. The steward set a cup down with mechanical courtesy, no warmth behind the gesture, before moving swiftly on. Bruce lifted the plastic cup, his hand trembling, a small ripple forming on the surface of the water. He steadied it with both hands before taking the smallest of sips, careful not to spill. From behind him, a muffled laugh again rippled through the air. The words that followed carried more clearly this time. Guy takes 10 minutes just to drink a cup of water. The comment hung there, low but deliberate, a barb meant to land. Bruce heard it, felt it, but he let the silence cover his reply. His jaw tightened, but his dignity remained intact. He set the cup carefully back on the tray, aligning it with the napkin. He shifted again, reaching for the small overhead light. His fingers stretched upward, slow and strained, just brushing the plastic switch. The angle was awkward, his shoulder stiff, and after 2 attempts he finally clicked it on. The light bathed him in a pale glow, separating him further from the dimness of the cabin. Several passengers squinted at the sudden brightness, one sighing audibly before covering his eyes with a hand. Bruce withdrew his arm, folding it across his lap once more, as though apologizing for existing. The attendant reappeared, her footsteps sharp in the narrow aisle. She paused briefly by his seat, eyes sweeping over the tray, the blanket, the trembling hands. Her smile did not return this time, only a curt nod before she moved on. The scent of her perfume lingered in the stale air, clashing with the faint plastic tang of the water in his cup. Bruce lowered his eyes, unwilling to meet her gaze, unwilling to invite another sting. The turbulence returned, gentle at first, a rolling shudder that shook the overhead compartments. The cup trembled, the water threatening to spill, and Bruce steadied it quickly with both hands. Across the aisle, a young man muttered, "Better hold on, old-timer, don't want to lose your juice." The remark was followed by a quiet laugh, quickly stifled but no less cutting. Bruce placed the cup down, folded the napkin once more across the tray, and rested his hands atop it. The photograph shifted beneath the blanket on his lap. Its presence felt, though unseen. He pressed down gently, grounding himself again. His breath came slow and controlled, the same way it had when dust and smoke once filled his lungs. Control was his only shield now. The passenger beside him shifted restlessly, jostling his elbow against Bruce's arm. The old soldier murmured a quiet, "Excuse me," and pulled inward as much as the cramped space allowed. The other man gave no acknowledgement, his eyes already closed, his earbuds shutting out the world. Bruce returned his gaze to the folded napkin, the surface of the tray, anything to avoid feeling like a burden in a space too small for forgiveness. Every detail of the plane seemed magnified. The flickering of a seatbelt sign, the faint whir of the air vent, the scrape of shoes against carpet as passengers visited the lavatory. To Bruce, each sound carried with it an edge, a reminder of how visible his every movement was. The more he tried to disappear, the more each tremor in his hand seemed to echo in the silence around him. His chest tightened with a familiar pressure, not fear, but memory pressing forward. A sudden flash came unbidden. A stretch of dirt road, men walking single file beneath a blazing sun, their boots dragging dust into the air. The memory lasted only a heartbeat, vanishing as the plane jolted again. He inhaled sharply, blinked the vision away, and returned to the present. Another steward passed, this one younger, his expression lighter, but even he slowed as he saw Bruce's stiff frame and trembling hand. For a moment, it seemed as though he might offer something. A smile, a word, perhaps assistance. But the moment passed, and he moved on, unwilling to draw the attention of others. The small opportunity for kindness dissolved in silence. Bruce shifted the photograph beneath the blanket again, fingertips brushing the fragile edges. The ritual steadied him. He could not control the voices around him, nor the cold glances, but he could control how carefully he guarded this single piece of the past. His silence was not weakness. It was choice, the only defense left to him. The young man across the aisle leaned closer to his friend, voice low but audible. "Look at this one. He takes forever just to sit still." Both men chuckled softly, their amusement private but deliberate enough to sting. Bruce did not lift his head. He stared down at his hands, folded neatly, as though in prayer. His shoulders remained squared, his dignity unbroken. The engine surged slightly as the plane adjusted course, the low rumble resonating through the cabin walls. Bruce closed his eyes once more, not in defeat, but in discipline. He allowed the rhythm to carry him, to muffle the cruelty in the air. He had endured worse storms. This too would pass. But the silence in his row felt heavier now, thick with tension, thick with judgment unspoken. His quiet dignity stood firm against the pressure, but he remained alone in it. Alone, except for the one pair of eyes still fixed on him, calculating. That gaze had grown sharper, the jaw set harder, as each insult layered upon the old soldier's silence. The watcher leaned forward slightly, hands tightening against the armrest. His restraint was thinning, and the moment for silence was drawing to an end. The plane shuddered with a sudden pocket of turbulence, jolting trays and rattling cups. A startled gasp swept through the cabin, followed by nervous laughter from a few younger passengers. Bruce Morris gripped the armrest tightly, his knuckles pale against the plastic, while the photograph slipped from beneath his blanket and drifted toward the floor. The fragile paper landed face down near his shoes, and for a moment, he simply stared, the tremor in his hands preventing immediate action. Slowly, painfully, Bruce bent forward to retrieve it. His back curved stiffly, his legs resisting the motion, each inch of movement a quiet struggle. He stretched a hand toward the aisle, fingers grazing the corner of the photograph, but it slid just beyond reach as the plane jolted again. The effort drew attention, and whispers rose from nearby seats, not of concern but of mock amusement. A younger passenger leaned over to his companion, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Careful, old man," he said loud enough for several rows to hear. "Don't break a hip down there." The laughter that followed was not cruelly sharp, but dismissive, the kind of laughter that strips a man of dignity without even noticing it. Bruce heard it clearly. His hand tightened around the photograph as he slowly pulled himself upright, his breath uneven, his cheeks flushed with quiet humiliation. The flight attendant appeared once more, her heels clicking against the aisle. She paused at his row, hands on her hips, her expression one of manufactured patience quickly fraying at the edges. "Sir," she said firmly, her voice carrying over the low hum of conversation, "if you can't manage yourself, we're going to have a problem." "Understood?" Bruce swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly in the dim light. His voice came thin, quivering but controlled. "Yes, understood." He nodded once, folding the photograph carefully against his chest. The gesture was gentle, reverent, as though protecting a piece of his very soul. From across the aisle, an older woman with kind eyes leaned forward slightly, her hand half raised as if to offer assistance. "Maybe I can help him," she began, her voice soft but firm. The attendant cut her off sharply, her tone clipped. "Ma'am, please stay out of this." The words dropped like a command, silencing the woman instantly. She recoiled, her hand falling back to her lap, shame flooding her features as she looked away. Bruce glanced at her briefly, a flicker of gratitude passing in his tired eyes, but he said nothing. Silence remained his armor. The laughter from the younger passengers grew bolder, fed by the attendant's dismissal. One leaned forward, whispering again with a mocking grin. "Maybe he's just rehearsing. You know, cosplay soldier or something." The comment carried easily in the quiet cabin, the cruelty wrapped in a smirk. Bruce's shoulders stiffened, but he did not flinch. He placed the photograph back on his lap, smoothed the creases with deliberate care, and adjusted the napkin on his tray once more. Each motion was precise, ordered, unbroken by the storm around him. His dignity held, even as ridicule chipped at its edges. The attendant lingered near the front of the row, her gaze flicking back toward Bruce every few moments. Her posture was defensive, her authority worn like a shield, yet there was no warmth in her presence, no recognition of the weight she was pressing upon a man already bowed by years. The hum of the engines grew louder as the plane steadied again. Yet in Bruce's row, the silence was heavier than the sound. Each passenger nearby felt the tension, though most turned away, burying themselves in books or screens, rather than face the discomfort of injustice playing out so close. Indifference became its own form of cruelty. Bruce's hand trembled slightly as he lifted the cup of water again, his reflection wavering in the surface. A single drop spilled onto the tray, spreading into the napkin. He watched the stain bloom slowly, a quiet mark of his fragility on the sterile plastic. He set the cup down carefully, eyes fixed on the spreading circle as though willing it not to grow. The young man across the aisle chuckled again, his voice low but audible. "There he goes. Can't even drink without making a mess." The words stung sharper this time, meant to humiliate, meant to amuse. His companion laughed with him, the sound carrying just enough to draw sidelong glances from others who chose still not to intervene. The older woman who had tried earlier shifted uncomfortably in her seat, guilt clouding her eyes. She looked again at Bruce, then lowered her gaze to her folded hands. She had been silenced once, and would not risk it again. Her silence weighed heavier than her attempt. Bruce lifted the photograph once more, holding it upright in both hands now, his thumb brushing across the faded ink. His eyes glistened, though no new tear fell. His breath steadied, his composure restored in the small ritual of remembrance. It was the only answer he gave, the only voice left to him. The attendant's voice cut through again, louder this time, drawing more attention from the rows around. "Sir, I will not repeat myself. If you cannot maintain yourself properly, action will be taken." The words were sharp, official, dripping with impatience. The eyes of passengers turned toward him again, the weight of judgment bearing down. Bruce lowered the photograph gently, tucking it against his chest with both hands. His lips pressed into a thin line, but he made no reply. He had borne harsher commands in far harsher places. He would not yield his dignity here, not even now. The air in the cabin thickened, every breath heavy with discomfort and unspoken tension. The sound of the engines became a dull roar, distant and muted compared to the silence pressing down on Bruce. Every eye that turned away, every whisper that lingered, became part of the weight he carried alone. But not every eye had turned. The watcher's gaze from several rows back had not faltered. His hands tightened against the armrests, his jaw set in stone. Each insult, each dismissal burned deeper into him. His patience, long trained, was thinning, and as Bruce sat quietly beneath the growing storm of humiliation, the silent presence behind him was shifting closer to action. The sting of the attendant's words still hung in the air, an invisible weight pressing against Bruce Morris's shoulders. Yet he did not answer, did not defend, did not protest. Instead, he adjusted himself slowly in the seat, spine stiffening as though a rod had been set behind it. The tremor in his hands eased as he set the photograph gently on the tray before him. His movements carried a strange calm, the deliberate cadence of ritual. He unfolded the napkin once more, smoothing it flat with the palm of his hand until no crease remained. The act was quiet, almost reverent, as though the thin square of fabric deserved the same respect as a flag folded at ceremony. Every motion was measured, no rush, no wasted gesture, only precision born of discipline that had never left him. The laughter from the aisle faded into murmurs, discomfort seeping into the edges. Passengers who had smirked before now shifted uneasily in their seats. Some turned their heads deliberately away, ashamed of their silence, yet unwilling to break it. Others stared still, caught between curiosity and unease, watching the old man move with a dignity that felt out of place in the cramped metal tube hurtling through the night. Bruce reached for his cup of water again. This time his hand did not tremble. He lifted it slowly, his grip firm, his gaze steady. The plastic ridges pressed into his fingers, and the surface of the water rippled but did not spill. He drank with care, one measured sip, then set it back precisely on the napkin as though marking its place on a map. The faint ring of condensation left on the fabric spread evenly, symmetrical, controlled. The young man across the aisle, who had chuckled earlier, shifted uncomfortably now. His grin faltered. Something about the old soldier's calm unsettled him. The laughter that had come easily moments before caught in his throat. He looked to his companion for support, but even his friend had quieted, eyes lowered to the floor. Bruce's face remained unreadable, lined but composed. His eyes, though wet, carried no shame now. They carried resolve. He lifted the photograph again, studying it in silence, his thumb resting lightly on the faded faces of the men frozen in time. He did not weep. He did not break. He simply looked, as though meeting their eyes once more across decades. The attendant, who had barked moments earlier, hesitated at the far end of the aisle. Her posture remained rigid, but something flickered across her face. Irritation mixed now with the faintest trace of doubt. She watched him fold the napkin, adjust the cup, hold the photograph with care, and for the first time, her voice did not rise to cut him down. She turned briskly away, but the sharpness in her step had softened, just slightly. The engines hummed steadily beneath the floor, a low vibration that carried through every bone. To Bruce, it was no longer the sound of confinement, but the sound of endurance. The drone reminded him of the endless march of time, of the nights he had endured far from the comfort of this cabin. Here, at least, the battle was silence, and silence he could master. Passengers shifted around him. One cleared his throat nervously. Another avoided his gaze altogether. The atmosphere had changed. Where once there had been ridicule, now there was hesitation, unease, something unspoken settling into the air. His quiet had become louder than their laughter. Bruce placed the photograph back against his chest, folding it into his shirt pocket with exact care. The motion was slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial. His hand lingered over his heart, pressing lightly against the fabric, grounding himself in the memory it held. It was a gesture of loyalty, of brotherhood, of promises carried long beyond their spoken word. He reached again for the cup, aligning it perfectly at the corner of the tray. Then he lifted the napkin, folded it neatly in half, then half again, before setting it beside the cup. The table now looked orderly, precise, no trace of the small mess from before. Where there had been disorder, there was now order again. The young woman with the child, who had earlier shifted away from him, glanced over once more. This time her expression was not irritation, but quiet thought. Her child, now asleep, rested peacefully against her arm, and she watched Bruce with a faint furrow in her brow. The sight of his care, his order, seemed to stir something unspoken in her. The silence deepened, but it was no longer oppressive. It was weighted, solemn, filled with an odd reverence none had expected when the laughter began. Bruce had not spoken a word since his apology, yet his presence filled the row. His dignity, once the target of ridicule, now held a quiet power that demanded acknowledgement. And from several rows back, the watcher saw it all. His sharp eyes studied the way Bruce folded, adjusted, endured. He recognized the precision in the motions, the discipline etched into the smallest details. This was not frailty on display. This was a soldier holding his line. The watcher's jaw tightened. His fingers drummed once against his armrest, then stilled. He leaned forward slightly, breath steady, eyes fixed on the old man's quiet strength. He knew that what was unfolding was not weakness, but defiance. the kind that required no words, only silence stronger than noise. Bruce adjusted his collar, straightened his spine once more, and closed his eyes briefly, breathing with calm control. In that moment, he was not a man humiliated. He was a man in formation, a soldier in posture, his dignity a uniform invisible to those who had mocked him. The cabin was silent now, save for the engine's low rumble. The earlier whispers had faded, the laughter had died. Even the attendant's voice carried more softly from the front of the plane. And still, Bruce Morris sat steady, his silence unbroken, his dignity intact. But in that silence, something else stirred. The watch's hand brushed lightly against the pocket of his jacket where his badge rested. His restraint, long held, was wearing thin. He had not moved yet, had not spoken yet, but the decision was forming in the set of his jaw, the fire in his eyes. And when he moved, the silence in the cabin would break forever. The hum of the aircraft pressed steadily against the cabin walls, a low vibration that seemed endless, but the tension inside Bruce Morris's brow remained sharper than the engines outside. The old soldier sat upright, his hand resting against the pocket where the photograph lay folded against his chest, his face drawn but calm. Around him, passengers avoided eye contact, pretending to return to their own worlds, though each still felt the unease of what they had witnessed. The silence was heavy, but it was no longer his alone. Several rows back, a man in his 40s leaned slightly forward in his seat. His build was sturdy, shoulders squared even in casual clothes, the posture of someone who had spent a lifetime training the body to be ready. His dark jacket blended into the dim cabin, unremarkable to most, but his eyes carried the sharp focus of one who noticed everything. He had watched every moment unfold, the tears, the mockery, the rebuke, and the silence that followed. His jaw was tight now, the muscles shifting as he clenched and released, the only outward sign of what brewed beneath. Daniel Cross had boarded the plane like any other traveler, quiet, unassuming, blending into the crowd. That was his duty, to be unseen, unnoticed, a presence hidden until necessity called him forward. For hours, he had remained a shadow among strangers. But now, as his gaze lingered on the frail man holding his dignity together with trembling hands, the duty he had sworn to uphold began to press differently on his chest. His fingers brushed the outline of the badge in his pocket, the small weight of it more pronounced than usual. He did not need to look at it. The metal was etched into his memory. The authority it carried a burden he rarely revealed. His training told him to remain silent unless the safety of the aircraft was at stake, but his conscience told him safety was more than the absence of danger. Safety was dignity. Safety was respect. He watched the old man fold the napkin with the precision of ritual. Each crease lined perfectly, each motion performed with care. Daniel recognized it instantly. The habit of a soldier. The discipline carried long after uniforms had been folded away for the last time. It was the same precision he had seen countless times in men who refused to let chaos strip them of order. And in that recognition, something inside him stirred. The attendant passed nearby again, her heels clicking against the thin carpet. Her smile returned for others but withheld from Bruce. Daniel's eyes tracked her carefully, his expression unreadable, his silence deliberate. He noted the tilt of her chin, the impatience still lingering in her gestures. Authority without compassion, discipline without understanding. He had seen it before in other places, and it had never sat well with him. Bruce lifted the cup of water once more, both hands steadying it this time, and took another sip. His lips pressed together after, his eyes downcast, but not broken. The precision of the gesture, drink, replace, align, carried its own defiance. Daniel's chest tightened at the sight. He could see in the smallest details the echo of barracks mornings, of inspection tables, of men who measured their worth by the care with which they performed even the smallest tasks. Passengers nearby continued to shift, uneasy, unwilling to intervene. A cough from the front broke the stillness. A child whimpered in her sleep, and the drone of the engines filled the gaps. Yet Daniel remained still, every sense tuned to the row ahead, his focus locked on the dignity of the man who sat alone in his defense. He had not risen yet, but the decision was coiling within him like a spring wound too tight. He thought of the men he had once known, the ones who had come home to silence, who had borne their scars quietly while the world moved on. He thought of the times he had watched indignity pass unchecked, moments when silence had been easier than confrontation. Each memory tightened the grip of his fingers against the armrest now, the tension visible in his knuckles. Bruce reached into his pocket and withdrew the photograph again. The dim light caught the faint outline of faces long gone, and he held it before him as though reacquainting himself with them. His lips moved faintly, not words but breath, a silent communion with those who had once stood beside him. Daniel's throat tightened at the sight, his jaw set harder, his breath measured to keep control. The young man across the aisle stirred again, emboldened by the lingering silence. He leaned closer to his companion, his voice louder this time, sharp enough for more of the cabin to hear. "What's he even crying for? Probably just wants attention." The words cut through the hum, careless, cruel, meant to belittle. Daniel's hand slid fully into his pocket now, fingers curling around the badge. His eyes narrowed, the calm mask slipping into something colder, sharper. He had not planned to intervene tonight, but some insults reached a line that could not be ignored. And as the cruel words hung in the air, the silent witness knew that line had just been crossed. The cruel remark still lingered in the air, sharp as broken glass. Probably just wants attention. A ripple of uneasy chuckles followed, and then the cabin returned to its low hum, as though cruelty could vanish if ignored. But the words had struck deeper than the laughter revealed. Bruce Morris sat motionless, his hand still pressed against the photograph, his eyes lowered. He did not defend himself. His lips pressed into a thin line, his shoulders squared with weary dignity. The insult might have cut into his chest, but he bore it with the silence of a man who had weathered storms harsher than ridicule. Yet someone else could not bear the silence any longer. From several rows back, Daniel Cross pushed his hands against the armrests and rose. The movement was not abrupt, not loud, but it carried a gravity that shifted the air around him. Passengers glanced up instinctively, drawn by the quiet authority in the way he straightened his jacket and stepped into the aisle. His presence was calm, but it filled the narrow space with a weight that could not be ignored. He moved forward with deliberate steps, the soles of his shoes muffled against the carpet, until he reached Bruce's row. There he paused, his gaze sweeping over the old soldier first, then flicking briefly to the attendant, then finally toward the passengers who had laughed. His eyes were steady, sharp, assessing. He lowered one hand gently onto Bruce's shoulder. The touch was firm but respectful, not of pity, but of solidarity. Bruce lifted his head slightly, startled, his weary eyes meeting the calm strength in Daniel's. No words passed between them, but something shifted in that look. Recognition, unspoken and immediate. Daniel turned his attention then to the attendant, who had frozen mid-step at the sight of him standing in the aisle. Her professional smile faltered, and she opened her mouth as though to speak, but Daniel's voice came first. It was low, measured, but carried enough steel to silence the cabin. "That's enough." The words were simple, but they dropped into the silence with the weight of command. Passengers leaned back instinctively, eyes darting between the two men and the attendant. The low drone of the engines seemed suddenly distant, overshadowed by the charged stillness pressing against every row. The attendant stiffened, her jaw tightening, as though unwilling to cede authority. "Sir, please take your seat." Interference in crew duties. Daniel's gaze locked on hers, unblinking, calm, but unyielding. "What's happening here is not duty," he said evenly. "It's cruelty, and it ends now." The murmurs in the cabin died instantly. Even those who had chuckled earlier now sat rigid, their expressions paling under the calm weight of his words. A hush spread, heavy and expectant, the kind that comes before something irreversible. Bruce shifted in his seat, his lips parting slightly as though to protest, to assure that he could endure. But Daniel's hand remained on his shoulder, steady, grounding. It was not a gesture of speaking for him, but of standing with him. The old soldier's throat worked, but no words came. He did not need them. The silence between the two men was enough. The younger passenger who had mocked him earlier leaned back into his seat, his smirk gone, his eyes lowered suddenly to his lap. His companion shifted as well, pulling his hoodie tighter around his shoulders as if to hide. The boldness that had come so easily moments before evaporated in the face of Daniel's quiet presence. Every pair of eyes in the cabin was now fixed on the aisle. Even the child stirred, her small voice breaking into a whimper before being hushed by her mother. The tension was palpable, thick as smoke, as though the aircraft itself had stopped breathing. Daniel did not raise his voice, did not need to. His stillness was louder than noise. He removed his hand slowly from Bruce's shoulder, then reached into his jacket pocket. His movements were unhurried, deliberate, each one dragging the silence tighter across the cabin like a drum skin stretched to breaking. Passengers leaned forward slightly, breaths caught, watching as his fingers brushed the inside of his jacket. The faint metallic edge of something glinted under the dim cabin light. The attendant froze, her expression caught between authority and dawning realization. Daniel drew his hand free, holding the small weight just beneath the level of the tray table. He had not revealed it yet, not fully, but the change in the air was immediate, as though every soul aboard sensed that something of great consequence was about to be placed before them. And as he straightened once more, the cabin sank into a silence so deep it seemed the engines themselves had hushed. The badge was still hidden in his palm, but not for long. Daniel Cross stood firm in the aisle, the cabin thick with tension that no one dared to break. His hand remained poised, the object still half concealed in his palm. The faces around him watched with wide eyes, uncertain, expectant, as though the air itself had grown heavier. Bruce Morris sat rigid in his seat, the photograph still pressed to his chest, his weary eyes fixed on the man standing over him. Then, slowly, deliberately, Daniel extended his hand forward and lowered it to the tray table in front of Bruce. His fingers opened, and the badge glinted briefly in the dim overhead light before coming to rest face down on the smooth surface. He did not thrust it forward, did not display it with pride or authority. Instead, he set it down gently, as though laying a token of trust between brothers. The silence deepened. No one moved. No one breathed. The weight of the gesture settled into the cabin like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward through every row. It was not an announcement, not a declaration. It was something older, deeper, quieter. Bruce's gaze fell to the badge. His hands trembled slightly as they rested atop the napkin on the tray, but he did not reach for it. Instead, his eyes lifted again, meeting Daniel's steady gaze. In that exchange, something unspoken passed. Recognition, respect, the knowledge of men who had walked roads few others could imagine. No words could have carried what their eyes already said. Bruce gave the faintest of nods, a motion so small it could have been missed by anyone not looking closely. But Daniel saw it, and in that nod was acceptance, gratitude, and the quiet acknowledgement of a brotherhood that did not need to be explained. Around them, the passengers shifted uneasily. Some sat straighter, as though trying to understand what they had just witnessed. The young man who had mocked Bruce earlier pressed back into his seat, his smirk gone, replaced by a nervous swallow. The attendant stood frozen a few rows ahead, her hands clasped tight against her skirt, her professional mask cracking at the edges. A woman in the opposite aisle leaned forward slightly, her eyes glistening as though she understood more than she could say. The child on her lap stirred, opening sleepy eyes just long enough to look toward the two men before drifting again into slumber. Even in her innocence, the silence seemed to touch her. The badge sat there, simple, unadorned on its back, its meaning hidden yet undeniable. It did not shout authority. It whispered responsibility. It was not a shield for one man, but a bond extended between two. Daniel had not offered it as proof of power, but as a pledge. I stand with you. Bruce's hand lifted slightly, hovering near the photograph in his pocket. His fingers pressed against the fabric once more, grounding himself in memory, even as the presence of the badge before him tethered him to the present. He looked again at Daniel, and for a moment, his tired face softened, the corners of his eyes easing in something close to peace. The passengers still held their breath, waiting, unsure of what might come next. Some felt shame prickling at the back of their necks, others curiosity, others a stirring of respect they had not expected when the flight began. The atmosphere was no longer ridicule, no longer indifference. It was reverence, though quiet, though uncertain, though incomplete. Daniel did not speak again. He did not need to. His stillness, his presence, his badge lying face down on the tray, spoke louder than words. It was not intervention, it was solidarity. And in that solidarity, something unshakable was born. The attendant swallowed hard, her eyes flicking between the badge and Bruce's steady posture. For the first time since the encounter began, she hesitated, her authority faltering. Her polished shoes shifted slightly, the first crack in the armor of her certainty. Bruce drew in a deep, steady breath. His chest rose, then fell, the sound audible in the silence. His dignity, long tested through whispers and sharp words, now stood fortified by another man's quiet strength. He was no longer alone in this cabin. And yet, the story was not complete. The passengers sensed it. The attendant sensed it. Even Bruce sensed it. Something deeper remained unspoken, a truth waiting just beyond the silence. For this was not just an act of solidarity. It was the beginning of revelation. The badge rested silently on the tray, its face hidden, its meaning resonating like a low drumbeat through the cabin. The weight of silence pressed harder, until even the engine's steady roar seemed muted against it. Bruce Morris sat steady, his trembling hands still folded against his chest where the photograph lay. His eyes had softened, but the weariness did not vanish. Dignity remained, but grief pressed close behind it. Daniel Cross drew in a controlled breath, his gaze never leaving the old soldier before him. The silence had spoken enough, but the truth could not remain unspoken forever. Slowly, evenly, he let his voice rise, not loud, but strong, carried with the certainty of memory. "Do you know," Daniel said, his eyes narrowing slightly, "what sound can still wake a man from sleep after 60 years? No one moved. The passengers froze, listening. Bruce's eyes lifted, a faint flicker of recognition sparking in them. Daniel's voice remained calm, but it carried weight. It's the last breath of a brother in arms. It is not forgotten. It never fades. The words landed heavy, each one sinking into the silence until the cabin itself seemed to hold its breath. Bruce's lips parted slightly, his chest rising as though he had been struck by the memory himself. His hand shifted, pulling the photograph slowly from his pocket. The edges were worn, corners bent, but the faces remained clear. Young men in dusty uniforms, their arms slung across each other, their smiles thin but alive. Bruce held the photograph out for just a moment, letting Daniel see, letting the cabin glimpse what he had guarded so carefully. His voice came at last, low, rough, but unshakable. "We promised to bring them home." A murmur stirred among the passengers, faint but heavy with realization. The photograph was not simply paper. It was a covenant, a memory bound by oath and blood. Bruce's eyes glistened, his breath catching as the moment pressed deeper. But some never made it. His hand shook as he folded the photo again, clutching it to his chest once more. And a man never forgets the ones who were left behind. Daniel's throat tightened, but he remained composed. He inclined his head slightly, as though saluting without motion. "No, he doesn't." The weight of truth rippled through the cabin. The young man who had mocked Bruce earlier leaned back into his seat, his face pale, his mouth set in a nervous line. He no longer looked smug, no longer bold. His eyes dropped to his lap, as though ashamed to meet the gaze of the old soldier he had ridiculed. The attendant shifted uncomfortably at the far end of the aisle. Her hands gripped each other so tightly the knuckles whitened. The sharp mask she had worn earlier faltered, her chin trembling faintly. The authority she had clung to now felt hollow in the shadow of what had been revealed. A woman near the front dabbed her eyes with a tissue, though she tried to keep her motion discreet. The man beside her bowed his head, his lips pressed tight, as though the weight of Bruce's words pressed into his own chest. Bruce's silence returned, but now it carried a different tone. No longer defensive, no longer bowed beneath humiliation, it carried the solemnity of memory shared and honored. His quiet was not weakness, it was testimony. Daniel let the moment breathe, let the silence carry the weight of the revelation. He did not rush to fill it. He knew the truth needed space to settle in every heart present. The photograph rested again in Bruce's pocket, but its echo lingered. The passengers could not unsee it, could not unhear the broken promise of men never returned. The truth had shifted the air forever. Daniel's hand pressed gently once more against the badge resting on the tray, anchoring the moment. He had not raised his voice, had not commanded the room. He had only spoken memory, and memory had silenced them all. The young men who had laughed before now stared at the floor, shame etched into their features. The attendant's throat worked, her words caught behind regret. And still, Bruce Morris sat steady, his dignity shining brighter now than at any moment before. The truth had been spoken, the past had been unveiled, and the ones who had mocked him could no longer look away. The revelation lingered like smoke after fire, clinging to every corner of the cabin. Passengers sat still in their seats, their eyes drawn back to the old soldier who had been mocked only moments before. Bruce Morris held himself upright, his chest rising with slow, steady breaths. The photograph remained pressed close to his shirt pocket, hidden now, but its presence was felt by all who had seen it. Daniel Cross stood beside him, his badge still resting face down on the tray. His eyes swept the cabin, calm and steady, as though measuring each person present. No command left his lips, no lecture, no anger. The silence itself was his judgment, and it carried more weight than fury ever could. The young man who had sneered earlier shifted in his seat, his face pale beneath the dim light. He glanced toward Bruce, then quickly looked away again, his shame too sharp to confront directly. His companion fiddled with the drawstring of his hoodie, his hands restless, his confidence gone. The boldness that had seemed so easy before now sat like a stone in their throats. At the far end of the aisle, the flight attendant stood rigid, her fingers twisting together at her waist. The polished veneers she had worn since takeoff had cracked, her eyes flicking nervously between Daniel, the badge, and the old man in the seat. Her jaw worked as though words pressed against her lips, but none emerged. Authority alone could not stand against the truth revealed before her. Daniel broke the silence at last, his voice calm but steady, carried with the even tone of a man who knew the weight of words. "From this moment," he said, looking first at the attendant, then at the passengers nearby, "when a veteran grieves, we do not hush them. We listen." The words rang through the cabin, not loud but resonant. They hung in the air long enough for every person to hear them twice in their own minds. They carried no fury, no condemnation, only correction spoken with the certainty of law. The attendant's lips parted, and she took a hesitant step closer. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached down, retrieving the napkin Bruce had smoothed so carefully. She folded it once, then placed it gently back on the tray before him. When she lifted her gaze to his, her eyes glistened faintly, her voice unsteady. I didn't understand," she whispered. Bruce did not speak. He only inclined his head slightly, his eyes calm, his face softened with weary grace. The gesture was not forgiveness spoken aloud, but it was enough. A man 2 rows back cleared his throat, then reached forward with a bottle of water. setting it carefully on the edge of Bruce's tray. He did not speak either, only offered a small nod as his hand withdrew. Another passenger, a woman near the window, pulled a thin airline blanket from her lap and leaned across to drape it gently over Bruce's knees. Her gesture was quiet, humble, offered not out of pity, but respect. The atmosphere shifted palpably. Where there had been ridicule and indifference, now there was reverence. It was not loud, not clapping or cheering. It was stillness transformed. Passengers lowering their heads, eyes softening, breaths held as though in the presence of something sacred. Bruce's hand rested against the photograph in his pocket once more, his thumb brushing the edge as if acknowledging the unseen company it represented. His lips did not move, but his silence now spoke volumes, filling the cabin more than words ever could. The young men who had mocked him earlier sat frozen, their eyes fixed on their laps. Their shame was a quiet thing, but visible. One of them opened his mouth as if to apologize, then shut it again, unable to form the words. Their silence was heavy, a different kind than Bruce's, but it too had meaning. Daniel remained standing, his badge still face down, his hand resting lightly on the back of Bruce's seat. He did not reclaim the token of his authority. He left it there, as if to remind them all that authority meant little without honor. His eyes, steady as stone, swept the cabin once more before settling back on Bruce. The engines droned on, indifferent to the transformation within the cabin. But every soul aboard knew something had shifted, not in noise or spectacle, but in the stillness of recognition. And yet, even in this moment of quiet awakening, the story had not reached its end. For what had been broken could not simply be patched. It had to be carried forward, reshaped into something lasting. And a new tradition was about to be born. 1 week later, Bruce Morris stepped carefully into the narrow aisle of another flight. The airport terminal had been its usual rush of footsteps and chatter, but here in the dim cabin, a gentler calm greeted him. He moved with the same slow precision, his limp still marking every step, his hand steadying himself against the overhead bins as he made his way to his seat. Yet this time, something in the air felt different. Passengers watched as he passed, but their eyes did not carry the impatient weight of before. A man in a business suit rose from his seat without hesitation, reaching up to help place Bruce's small bag in the overhead compartment. He did not make a show of it, did not speak loudly or smile for approval. He only nodded once, respectfully, and returned to his seat. Bruce inclined his head in quiet thanks, his lips curving into the faintest smile. When he settled into his seat, smoothing his worn flannel shirt against his knees, he found a folded napkin already resting on the tray. On top of it sat a small pin, a flag lapel shining modestly under the overhead light. The gesture was simple, unannounced, yet it carried the weight of recognition. Bruce lifted the pin gently in his hand, his thumb tracing its smooth edges. He glanced toward the front of the cabin and saw her, the same attendant who had spoken so harshly before. She stood now with her hands folded, her eyes meeting his across the rows. There was no mask this time, no rigid authority. She gave only a small nod, her lips trembling into a faint, apologetic smile. He did not answer with words. Instead, he pinned the flag to his shirt pocket, just above where the photograph rested inside. His hand pressed over both, the symbol of the present and the memory of the past, united in a single gesture. Around him, the passengers responded in quiet ways. A man across the aisle tipped his cap slightly, a gesture so small it could have been missed, if not for the sincerity behind it. A steward came by with a cup of coffee, placing it gently on the tray with a soft, "On the house, sir." Another passenger, a young woman near the window, leaned forward with a smile that carried no pity, only respect. The cabin carried none of the mockery of before, none of the cold dismissal. It carried instead a quiet reverence, born not of obligation but of awakening. Bruce was not worshipped, not set apart. He was simply seen. And in that recognition lay the dignity that had been stripped from him days before. Bruce leaned back in his seat, the hum of the engines filling his ears, and closed his eyes. His hand remained over his chest, fingers pressed against the photograph and the pin. A faint smile softened his weathered face, the kind of smile that comes not from victory, but from belonging. The attendants moved about their duties, passengers settled into their routines, and yet the atmosphere had shifted. What had been one man's humiliation had become a quiet tradition. To listen, to notice, to honor, without fanfare. As the plane carried him through the dark sky, Bruce rested in the rare peace of being remembered, being respected, being seen. If stories like this resonate with your heart, like and subscribe for more untold moments of honor and kindness. Let us know where you are watching from, and if this moment brought back memories you carry with you. The best way to honor their memory is to keep listening. Click on the suggested video now, and we will walk together through another untold chapter of courage and sacrifice.